It was supposed to be just another thrill-seeking adventure. You know, one of those experiences where you and your friends get together, pay a fee, and listen to someone tell creepy stories about ghosts and haunted houses. Honestly, I wasn't expecting much. I'd seen enough horror movies and ghost shows to know how these tours usually went. Someone would stand in front of a haunted house, tell a few spooky stories, and the group would walk away with a few chills but nothing substantial. That's why when my friends invited me to join a haunted tour at the old Winthrop estate, I didn't think twice. The mansion had been abandoned for years, supposedly haunted by the spirits of the original owners who mysteriously vanished decades ago. It was the perfect opportunity to mock the ghost hunters and show off my skepticism. We met at the entrance to the estate just as the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the dilapidated building. The mansion, hidden in the woods, was a sprawling structure with tall, narrow windows, crooked towers, and ivy clinging to every surface. It looked like something straight out of a gothic horror movie, a place where ghosts would definitely live. The atmosphere was already heavy with anticipation, and I could see the excitement and the slight nervousness on the faces of the other participants. Our guide, a man in his late 30s with shaggy hair and a thick accent, greeted us warmly, though there was something in his eyes that unsettled me. He had a calm demeanor, but I could see a trace of something dark lurking beneath the surface. As the group gathered around him, he started with the usual spiel, talking about the estate's history and how it was one of the most haunted places in the area. We all chuckled, half amused, half skeptical. It wasn't anything I hadn't heard before, but the group seemed to buy into it, exchanging nervous glances and excited whispers. "All right, folks," the guide said, cutting through the chatter with a raised hand. "Before we start, there's one rule, one simple rule." The group quieted down, intrigued. He paused, making eye contact with each of us. "Don't look back." A brief silence followed his words, and some of the group laughed, assuming he was joking. But the guide didn't smile. His eyes were serious, almost unnervingly so. I noticed the way he held himself, the tightness in his posture. There was something intense in his gaze, something that made me question whether he was serious. "Don't look back," he repeated, his voice low but commanding. "Not unless you have to. If you do, you will see things you're not supposed to see. Things you don't want to see. Do you understand? I mean it." A few nervous chuckles broke the tension, and I felt my unease melt away. Surely, this was part of the tour, just some psychological trick to make the experience scarier. After all, the whole point was to make people feel like they were in danger, like they were on the edge of something sinister. Right? "Now," the guide continued, his eyes scanning the group once more, "let's begin." With that, he led us into the darkened path that wound around the back of the mansion. The group fell into a semicircle behind him, our footsteps soft against the damp earth as we walked toward the main entrance. The trees above us swayed in the wind, casting shadows that stretched across the path, making the entire estate look even more ominous. The air felt cool, and the faint smell of old wood and earth clung to the breeze. The mansion seemed to loom above us, dark and imposing. The flickering light from the lanterns the guide carried cast long, shifting shadows against the stone walls. For a moment, I allowed myself to feel the slightest twinge of unease, but I quickly dismissed it. Ghosts? Haunting spirits? I wasn't buying it. But then I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us as we walked. The shadows in the windows seemed to move, and for a brief second, I thought I saw a figure standing in one of them. I blinked, but the figure was gone. Just my imagination, I thought. The darkness had a way of playing tricks on your eyes, especially when you're trying to find a scare. The guide's voice broke through my thoughts. He was explaining the history of the mansion, mentioning the tragic disappearances of the family that had once lived there. The story was chilling, as all good ghost stories are, but I couldn't help but focus on one thing: the lingering feeling. Something wasn't right, and I wasn't sure if it was the story, the atmosphere, or my own nerves. The moment I tried to ignore it, I felt it, the sensation of being watched. And that was when I realized the truth. The house wasn't just part of the tour, it was a tour, and I was about to find out why. The night air grew heavier as we walked deeper into the grounds of Blackthorn Manor. The mansion loomed ahead, its towering form outlined by the dim lantern light the guide held in front of him. The soft rustle of trees above us seemed louder now, the wind whispering through the leaves in a way that felt unnatural. The house, with its crooked windows and crumbling stone walls, was a silent observer of the world outside, watching us through its cold, black eyes. Our group shuffled along, quiet except for the occasional nervous laugh or muttered remark. I noticed a few people clutching their coats tighter, their faces pale under the flickering lantern light. But none of them seemed to question the one rule the guide had laid out for us. Don't look back. As I walked, I caught myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something lurking in the darkness. But all I saw was the empty path, the mist curling at my feet. The guide led us to the front entrance of the mansion, a grand, arched doorway that creaked loudly as it opened. The large wooden doors groaned in protest, like the house itself was reluctant to let us in. I could feel my heartbeat quicken as we entered the foyer. The dim light barely illuminated the grand space, and the cold, musty air seemed to press in on me. The floor beneath my feet was covered in layers of dust, and the scent of old wood and mildew clung to everything. The guide stopped and turned to face us. "This," he said in a soft, almost reverent tone, "is where it all began. Blackthorn Manor has stood here for centuries, and the souls that linger within these walls, well, they're still here." The group shuffled nervously, some of the more skeptical tourists chuckling under their breath, but the guide's serious expression silenced them quickly. "Tonight, we'll be exploring the manor," he continued, "and I'll tell you the stories of those who were trapped here. Some are still waiting for release, but before we begin, remember the rule I gave you." A few of us exchanged uneasy glances. "Don't look back," I repeated under my breath, not sure why I suddenly felt like that warning held more weight than it had when it was first spoken. The guide didn't smile, and his eyes were sharp as he continued. "Looking back isn't just dangerous, it can be deadly. If you see something that doesn't belong, don't look again, don't seek it out. The house will show you things you shouldn't see. You may think it's a trick of the light, but trust me, nothing here is a trick." I shifted uncomfortably. The atmosphere in the room had changed, the air growing thick and oppressive. It was as if the very walls of Blackthorn Manor were listening, waiting, and the weight of centuries of secret settled on my shoulders. The guide held up a hand, as if to emphasize his next words. "Whatever you do, don't break the rule. If you do, you will not leave here the same." His gaze swept over the group, and I saw the flicker of something in his eyes, something ancient, something burdened by knowledge that none of us could comprehend. "Understand?" We all nodded, a few nervously. I couldn't tell if he was serious or if it was part of the act, but his words, his tone, there was something in them that made me hesitate. I glanced back at the doorway, half expecting to see someone standing there. But there was only the same oppressive darkness, swallowing everything beyond the house's walls. "Now, follow me," the guide said, turning toward the winding staircase that led to the upper floors. The stairs creaked under his weight, but I noticed that none of the others dared question him. We followed quietly, the only sounds our footsteps and the occasional murmur of nervous excitement from a few of the group members. As we moved deeper into the house, I noticed how the light from the lantern seemed to flicker and fade, casting eerie, shifting shadows on the walls. It was as if the house itself was alive, shifting with each step we took. I could hear the faint hum of something, a sound just below the threshold of hearing, that seemed to vibrate through the very walls. It was impossible to ignore. It was a presence, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The guide led us down a long hallway, the shadows stretching around us. There were more doors, old, creaky doors that stood closed like sentinels. I couldn't help but notice how many of them seemed to be locked, or at least sealed. Some of the windows were covered with heavy curtains, and the air grew cooler as we walked further into the mansion. I was starting to feel the weight of it, the weight of the house's history, the weight of the darkness surrounding us. I couldn't explain it, but the longer I stayed in Blackthorn Manor, the more I felt watched. It was as though the house itself was aware of our presence, tracking our every movement. Every step I took felt heavier, as though something was pulling me in. Finally, the guide stopped in front of a large door at the end of the hallway. "This is the grand parlor," he said softly. "It's where many of the more unsettling events took place. You'll see what I mean soon enough." We stepped inside, and the temperature seemed to drop several degrees. The room was vast, with high ceilings and ornate furniture covered in dust. The furniture was old, faded, and the walls were lined with portraits, paintings of people I assumed had once lived here. But their eyes followed me. It was as if they were looking through me, seeing something I couldn't. The guide motioned to a chair in the center of the room. "Take a seat. The real experience begins here." The group shuffled forward, the atmosphere thickening with every step. As we settled into place, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something that wasn't part of the act. The house had already begun to show us its secrets, and I wondered what would happen if I dared to break the rule. But the guide's warning echoed in my mind, louder than ever. Don't look back. The atmosphere in the grand parlor of Blackthorn Manor felt suffocating. The oppressive silence weighed heavily on me as the group shuffled into place, settling on the old, dust-covered furniture. The room was expansive, filled with dark wood furniture, faded tapestries, and ancient portraits that lined the walls. But there was something strange about the room. It felt as though the walls were watching us, their gaze fixed, lifeless yet intense. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were not alone in here, and not just because of the tour guide's unsettling presence. The house itself felt alive, breathing with us, keeping a watchful eye. I caught myself glancing over my shoulder every few seconds, half expecting to see something or someone lurking just out of sight. But each time, the room remained empty, its silence pressing down harder with every passing second. The guide, who had introduced himself as Malcolm, turned to face us as we sat, his face suddenly grave. The light from his lantern flickered, casting long shadows across his face, making his features appear more sinister in the dimness. The others in the group sat eagerly, some of them excited, others nervously shifting in their seats, but no one seemed to question the seriousness of his demeanor. It felt like the tone of the tour had changed. He took a step forward, his voice low and commanding as he spoke. "Before we proceed, there is one thing you all need to understand. One rule you must follow for your own safety. It is simple, but it could mean the difference between life and death." The group fell silent, every eye on him. His words carried a weight that none of us had expected. The air, thick with tension, seemed to grow colder, and the flickering lantern light cast a faint glow over his face. He continued, his voice even darker now. "Do not look back." A few nervous chuckles escaped from the group. It was a strange rule, one that seemed more like a cautionary tale than anything else. But Malcolm's expression didn't change. His eyes locked on us all, and for the first time I felt a chill settle in my chest. He wasn't joking. "You see," he continued, "this house has a way of pulling on you. It's not just the spirits. The house itself, well, it's old. It has a history, and it doesn't like strangers. If you look back, if you give in to the urge to turn and look, well, you'll see something. You'll see things that you're not meant to." A heavy silence followed his words. I could feel the eyes of the others on me, some filled with doubt, others with growing uncertainty. A few shrugged it off with a laugh, as if this was just some exaggerated part of the tour. But the way Malcolm spoke, there was no doubt in his voice. He meant it. "This house is not what it seems," he said, his gaze sweeping across the group. "It has a way of seeing you, of making you feel watched, and if you look back, if you look into the darkness, it will pull you in. It will never let you leave." I looked around at the others, and though their faces remained calm, I saw it in their eyes. Fear, uncertainty. Everyone was feeling it. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The room seemed to grow colder, and for a moment, the light from the lantern seemed to flicker more rapidly, as if responding to Malcolm's words. "You're all thinking this is just part of the act," Malcolm continued, his tone now soft, almost sympathetic. "You think I'm just trying to build suspense, but listen to me. This house is dangerous, and it has a rule of its own. If you look back, it will take something from you." He paused, letting the silence settle. No one spoke, and the air felt thick with dread. The weight of the warning hung heavily in the room, and for the first time I understood that this wasn't a normal haunted tour. This wasn't a show. This was real. Malcolm's gaze softened just a little, as if he understood the skepticism in the group. "I know it's hard to believe, but if you follow the rules, you'll be safe. Do not look back. Do not stray from the path, and do not engage with anything you hear or see in the shadows. And if you must, if you feel something watching you, do not look into the mirrors. Trust me, you will regret it." I swallowed hard, trying to shake off the feeling that I was being drawn into something much deeper than I had anticipated. The group seemed to relax a bit after the intense warning, some nervously laughing, others awkwardly shifting in their seats, trying to lighten the mood. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the house itself was listening, waiting for one of us to make a mistake. Malcolm's warning had a weight to it that none of us could deny. The oppressive silence in the room seemed to stretch for eternity, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder once more. The house felt too quiet, too still, as if it were waiting. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the silence was broken again. "We'll begin the tour now," Malcolm said, his voice cutting through the stillness. "But remember, don't look back, and stay close. The house has a way of making you lose your way. He turned and began to lead us through the grand parlor, gesturing toward a narrow door that led into the hallway beyond. The air was thick with anticipation, and as I followed him, I felt a strange tension in the pit of my stomach. My steps were hesitant, my gaze flickering toward the corners of the room, toward the shadows that seemed to creep in just beyond the light. For a moment, I considered turning around, to look, to see what was behind me. But as I glanced back, I could feel it, the weight of something unseen, waiting. I quickly turned away, forcing myself to focus on the tour to ignore the growing unease, but I couldn't shake it. The one simple rule, was already feeling like a matter of life and death. As we continued our tour, I could feel the weight of Malcolm's warning hanging over me, suffocating the air. The mansion felt different now, more alive, as though the walls themselves were watching our every move. The shadows seemed darker, more pronounced, as though they had taken on a life of their own. Despite the laughter and the casual conversation of the group, a heavy tension hung in the air that no one could ignore. We were being watched. We followed Malcolm down a narrow hallway lined with old, faded tapestries and portraits of somber faces. The light from his lantern flickered as we passed, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to twist and curl in ways they shouldn't. I tried not to look back, to keep my focus on the path ahead, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness was reaching for me. Every time I glanced into a mirror or window, my reflection seemed to linger a fraction of a second longer than it should, as though it had its own will, a silent observer within the reflection. "There's a story behind every room in this house," Malcolm said, his voice low and almost reverential as he led us deeper into the mansion. "Some of them aren't for the faint of heart. The spirits who roam here have unfinished business, and some of them are eager to share their stories. But don't worry, as long as you don't look back, you'll be safe." I glanced at the others in the group. Some were still visibly nervous, their eyes darting around the dark hallway, but others appeared to have relaxed into the ambiance, pretending it was all just theatrics. Still, I could see that none of them were brave enough to break the one rule, especially as we moved deeper into the house. The silence between us grew heavier with every step, and I couldn't help but feel as though we were being herded towards something. We reached a door at the end of the hallway, and Malcolm paused. "This is the library," he said, his voice growing even more solemn. "Not many come in here. The books inside are not meant for casual reading." His eyes flicked to the door with an almost imperceptible hint of dread before he stepped aside, allowing the group to enter. I followed the others inside, and the moment I stepped across the threshold, I felt a change in the air. The temperature dropped several degrees, and a strange, almost suffocating heaviness settled over the room. The walls of the library were lined with towering shelves filled with books, their spines cracked and yellowed with age. The room smelled of old paper, mildew, and something heavier, something ancient. The air itself seemed thick, and every step felt weighted, as if I were walking through molasses. The group scattered, meandering through the aisles of bookshelves, but I couldn't focus on anything but the growing sensation in my chest. The library felt alive, like something was watching me from between the books. I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was breathing, that I was intruding on something far older, far darker than any of us had been told. I moved further into the room, trying to distract myself by looking at the ancient volumes lining the shelves. But every so often, I would catch the faintest movement out of the corner of my eye, just a flicker of something, a shadow slipping between the books. I told myself it was just the flickering light from Malcolm's lantern, but the unease continued to grow. Then it happened. A soft whisper. So soft, it might have been a trick of the wind, but it sounded too clear. "Help me." I froze. My heart skipped a beat as I looked around the room, scanning the faces of the group. No one else seemed to hear it. The others were still casually browsing the bookshelves, oblivious to the sense of something wrong that was pressing in on me. I glanced at the shelves, but nothing was out of the ordinary. The whispering had stopped, leaving only the sound of my own breathing. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that the room wasn't empty. The sense of being watched was stronger here than anywhere else in the house. Then, as I turned to leave, I saw it. A figure standing motionless at the far end of the room, half hidden in shadow. It wasn't one of the other tourists. It wasn't Malcolm. The figure was tall, its form shrouded in darkness. I could see no features, just a shape that seemed to be waiting. I took a step back, my pulse quickening. I told myself it was a trick of the light, just another part of the mansion's oppressive atmosphere. But the figure didn't move. It stood there, unmoving, watching me. I slowly backed away, but I couldn't look away. The figure remained in my field of vision, and then, suddenly, it was gone. I blinked, my breath caught in my throat. I rushed toward the door of the library, nearly stumbling as I exited the room, my heart pounding. The whispers seemed to follow me, echoing through the halls of the mansion, the voice of a spirit that wanted something. I didn't know what it was, but I could feel it, its presence, its pull. The group had gathered outside the library, looking around, but no one had noticed the same things I had. "Is everything all right?" Malcolm asked, his voice tinged with concern, though his eyes glinted with something else, something unreadable. I nodded quickly, trying to brush it off, but my stomach churned. The unease in the pit of my stomach only grew stronger with each passing minute. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something had changed. The house was alive with something ancient, and it wasn't going to let us leave easily. As we moved further into the mansion, I realized that the warning had been more than just a precaution. It was necessary. Something in Blackthorn Manor wanted us to look back, to see the things that were hidden in the shadows, and if we did, we would be drawn into the curse that had bound this place for so long. And I knew, deep in my gut, that this wasn't just a haunted house, it was a prison for those who couldn't resist looking back. As we moved deeper into the heart of Blackthorn Manor, the oppressive atmosphere grew heavier, suffocating the group with an invisible weight. The walls seemed to groan with the house's age, and the air felt thick, like it was filled with the secrets of generations that had been buried here. The whispers I'd heard earlier had stopped, but the sense of being watched had only intensified. It wasn't just the feeling of the house observing us, it was the spirits. They were here. I could feel them. Malcolm led us into another room. This one, an expansive dining hall that looked like it had once been the heart of the estate. The grand chandelier above our heads was covered in a thick layer of dust, and the long oak table at the center was untouched, as though the spirits who had once dined here were still seated, waiting for someone to join them. The windows, tall and arched, seemed to stretch toward the ceiling, and the curtains hung limp, gathering dust. I couldn't help but feel like I had stepped into a forgotten moment in time, a place where the world had simply stopped. The air was colder here, more still, and it seemed like the house was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Malcolm's lantern cast long shadows on the walls as he explained the history of the dining room. "This was the scene of the last Blackthorn family dinner," he said, his voice almost reverent. "After that night, the family disappeared, vanished without a trace. There was no sign of struggle, no sign of violence, just gone." A chill ran down my spine. I had heard stories of hauntings, of missing people and unsolved disappearances. But there was something different about this place. It wasn't just a house. It wasn't just haunted. It was alive, feeding on the fear and suffering of those who entered. As we explored the room, I noticed a portrait hanging on the far wall. It depicted a family, once proud and regal, but the faces had faded with time. Their eyes, though, were strange. They seemed to follow me, their gazes heavy, almost accusing. The longer I looked at the painting, the more unsettling it became. I felt as if they were watching my every move, waiting for me to make a mistake. Malcolm was speaking again, but his words seemed to fade in the background. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was moving in the room with us. The air had grown thicker, and my breath came in short, shallow bursts. I turned to glance at the others, but they seemed oblivious, their attention focused on the tour. It was as if they couldn't feel what I felt, that sense of being followed by something invisible. It was then that I heard it, a soft scraping sound, like something moving across the floor. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, the floorboards creaking under our weight. But the sound grew louder, sharper, more distinct. It was a slow, deliberate noise, like something, or someone, dragging itself across the room. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I looked at the others. They hadn't heard it. They were still listening to Malcolm, hanging on his every word. But the sound was getting louder now, closer. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I felt my muscles tense, my legs shaking beneath me. I had to look. I had to see what it was. I turned toward the source of the sound, toward the far end of the room, where the floorboards seemed to shift under some unseen weight. The darkness in the corners seemed to grow deeper, as though the shadows were gathering, pulling themselves toward the center of the room. And then I saw it. A figure, tall, emaciated, with long, thin limbs that moved in jerky motions. It crawled across the floor, dragging itself slowly, deliberately, its face hidden in shadow. The figure moved toward the portrait, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. The eyes in the painting, the family, seemed to flicker with life, their gazes now directed at the figure crawling toward them. I blinked, and when I looked again, the figure was gone. The shadows had returned to normal, and the air was still once more. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, but the fear that had gripped my chest wouldn't let go. I could still feel the weight of the gaze from the painting, still hear the faint scraping sound echoing in my mind. The house knew I had seen it. It was waiting for me to make the next move. I quickly turned to Malcolm, my voice shaky as I asked, "Did anyone else hear that?" He looked at me with a strange, unreadable expression. "What did you hear? The scraping, the dragging noise?" I tried to explain, but he only nodded solemnly, his eyes darkening as if he knew exactly what I was talking about. "Don't worry about it," he said quietly. "The house does that sometimes. It's just part of the experience." But it wasn't part of the experience. I could feel it deep in my gut. Whatever was happening here, whatever had happened here, was real. This wasn't a haunted house for show. It was alive, and it wasn't just the spirits of the past who were trapped here. There was something else, something far darker that was feeding on our fear. The tour continued, but my focus had shifted. I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder. The house was no longer just a setting for spooky stories. It was something else, something hungry. And I knew, without a doubt, that the one rule Malcolm had given us, the rule to never look back, wasn't just a precaution. It was a warning. The mansion didn't want us to leave. It wanted us to stay. It wanted us to become part of it. And I feared I had already stayed too long. As the tour continued, the atmosphere in Blackthorn Manor grew more oppressive with each step. The air was thick with something unseen, like the mansion itself was alive, breathing with us. It wasn't just the shadows stretching across the walls, or the strange feeling that the house was watching us. It was the overwhelming sense that something was waiting for someone to make a mistake, and I could feel it deep in my bones. I had already made mine. The weight of Malcolm's warning, "Don't look back," sat heavily in my mind, a constant nagging whisper. The rules weren't just to guide us through a spooky tour, they were there to protect us, and I realized that now. But as the night wore on, the urge to look back, to see, grew stronger. It was as though something in the house was calling me, tugging at me from the corners of my mind. Every time I glanced into the darkness, I felt that pull, closer, stronger, more real. Malcolm led us down yet another hallway, the walls now covered in dusty portraits of long-dead ancestors. Their eyes followed us as we passed, their faces frozen in eerie, lifeless expressions. The flickering lantern light cast disturbing shadows that seemed to move on their own, making the faces in the paintings shift and contort, as if they were trying to speak to us. The tension in the group was palpable. No one dared laugh or make a joke now. The air was thick, heavy with a growing sense of dread. We reached the next part of the tour, the old library. Its doors opened with a slow, grinding sound, the creak of wood echoing through the hall like a warning. The room was vast, filled with old, leather-bound books, their spines cracked and faded with age. The shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, and in the center of the room stood a large, ornate fireplace, its hearth cold and untouched for years. A single light from the guide's lantern illuminated the space, but the rest of the room was swallowed in shadow. Malcolm began to speak again, but I wasn't listening. My eyes kept drifting to the far corners of the room. I could feel something there. Something wrong. I couldn't place it, but the unease in my stomach had become a gnawing, relentless force. I could almost hear whispers coming from the far side of the room, faint at first, but growing louder as I stood there, rooted to the spot. It was like a dark symphony, a choir of voices that merged into one. They spoke in soft, unintelligible murmurs, their words lost in the space between the walls, but the message was clear. Look. You must look. I fought it. I knew I shouldn't. I had already broken one rule, wandering from the security of the group, but this felt different. This felt urgent. My body moved before my mind could catch up, and my head turned, slowly, toward the far corner of the library. At first, there was nothing, just shadows. But as I looked deeper into the darkness, I saw them. Figures, standing still, watching us. Their outlines were blurry at first, as though they were part of the darkness itself. But as my eyes adjusted, I could see them more clearly. The figures were tall, thin, their faces blank, void of expression. They didn't move, they didn't speak, they just stood there, staring at me. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The air around me seemed to thicken. The whispering voices had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. And then, just as I felt a cold hand settle on my shoulder, one of the figures stepped forward. "You should have listened," a voice whispered. a soft, breathless sound that sent a chill down my spine. I spun around, but there was no one behind me. The group hadn't noticed, still huddled together in the middle of the room, listening to Malcolm speak. I could feel the sweat trickling down my back, my fingers trembling as I held on to the lantern. Look back. The words were in my head now, louder, more insistent. They weren't mine, but they felt as if they were coming from the very walls of the room. The figures hadn't moved, but I could feel their eyes on me, their gaze heavy and unblinking. I wanted to look away. I tried to look away, but my body betrayed me. I turned back toward the shadows, and that's when I saw it. The figure was no longer standing still. It had moved. It was standing right in front of me now, its tall, gaunt frame looming over me. Its face was covered by a mask, a smooth, featureless surface that reflected no light, but I could feel it, the malevolent presence beneath the mask. "You shouldn't have looked," the voice repeated, this time from behind me. But when I turned, there was no one there. The figure in front of me reached out, its long fingers brushing against my arm. The touch was ice cold, like death itself had wrapped its hand around me. My breath caught in my throat, and I stumbled backward, slamming into a bookshelf. The books on the shelves trembled, their spines creaking as though they, too, were alive. The figure didn't move. It stood there, waiting, watching. It wasn't just a ghost. It was something far worse, something that had always been there. The lights flickered again, and I felt the temperature drop in the room, as though the shadows were feeding off the fear in my heart. The whispers started again, louder this time, growing in intensity until they were a deafening roar in my ears. My head spun as the pressure in the room mounted, the walls closing in on me. Look back. The command was a shout now, a demand that couldn't be ignored. I turned, and in that moment, everything changed. The room collapsed. The walls shattered like glass, the figures in the shadows pouring into the space, their bodies twisting and distorting as they consumed the light, consumed everything. I screamed, but the sound was lost in the crushing weight of the darkness. The door, the exit, was too far away, too unreachable. The voices, the figures, the shadows, they had taken me. And I realized then, too late, that I had broken the one rule that mattered. The mansion was no longer a building. It was a living, breathing nightmare, and I was trapped in its heart. The walls closed in on me as the shadows twisted and writhed, the figures I had seen before growing in size, moving like serpents, like something alive. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in shallow gasps, but no matter how fast I moved, the shadows seemed to follow. The temperature plummeted and the voices swelled, a cacophony of whispers and screams that reverberated through my mind, filling every corner of the room with their cold, insistent demands. You should have never looked back. Now you are ours. I tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the overwhelming presence pressing in around me. I could feel the walls tightening, the floor beneath me trembling with the force of something dark, something ancient. The air was thick with fear, and the shadows seemed to feed off it, growing stronger with each passing second. My hands shook as I gripped the lantern, its light flickering weakly, barely illuminating the space around me. The figure with the mask stepped forward, its form growing clearer now, as though the darkness itself was coalescing into something tangible. The mask was featureless, smooth like glass, reflecting the faint light in a way that sent shivers down my spine. It was staring at me, watching me, as it had been since the moment I set foot in Blackthorn Manor. You shouldn't have looked. The voice came from the figure's mouth, But it wasn't just its voice. It was the voice of the mansion itself, the voice of the entity that had haunted this place for centuries. The words echoed in the room, drowning out all other sound. "You've broken the rule, and now you will join us." I felt the weight of the curse settle over me, its cold fingers wrapping around my heart. I could hear the spirits, feel them, pressing in from all sides, their mournful wails filling the air, their eyes glaring at me from the shadows. They had been trapped here, just like I was now. The mansion was their prison, and I had unknowingly become its newest inmate. The shadows closed in around me, their cold, skeletal hands reaching out to pull me into the darkness. I could feel their cold touch on my skin, their fingers brushing against my arms, their breath like ice on my neck. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, to get out, but the house had already claimed me. I was trapped. I thought of Evelyn's warning, of the rules she had given me, of the one rule I had already broken. She had told me the mansion was alive, but I hadn't truly understood what that meant. I had come here seeking thrill, seeking answers, but now I knew the truth. Blackthorn Manor wasn't just haunted. It was the curse. It was the prison, the gateway to something darker, something far older than any of us could comprehend. The figure in front of me took another step, and I could feel its cold presence pressing in on me. It was almost within reach. Too close. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to get out. I had to escape. But as I took a step back, the figure reached out, its long, thin fingers brushing against my cheek. It was the touch of death, of something that had been trapped in time, and I could feel its power draining me, sapping the life from me. I gasped, stumbling back, and in that moment I felt the pressure of the entire mansion, the weight of centuries of spirits all pressing in on me, suffocating me. And then, as if by instinct, I did the one thing I knew I had to do. I looked back. The room shifted. The walls distorted, stretching and warping as the figure's form flickered like a dying light. The shadows receded, and I could hear the wailing of the spirits growing quieter. The mansion groaned, its ancient bones creaking in protest as though it were fading, as though it were being pulled into a different plane, a different reality. The figure screeched, its voice a high-pitched, inhuman wail that filled the room with a sound that made my ears ring. The lantern in my hand flickered violently, and for a moment I saw the truth. I saw the reflection in the glass of the lantern, the doorway, a rippling portal, a tear between worlds. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. The room was silent. The shadows had disappeared, the spirits' voices now faint echoes in the back of my mind. I stood there, my body shaking, my mind reeling. The mansion, Blackthorn Manor, was still. The oppressive weight that had hung in the air for so long was gone. The house had been broken. The curse had been sealed. But I knew it wasn't truly over. I had seen it. The doorway. The mansion had merely been waiting, watching for someone to break the rule, to look back. And now it was closed, but only for a time. I backed toward the door, my heart still racing, my breath ragged in my chest. The room seemed empty now, but I knew deep in my bones that the mansion would always be there. It would wait for the next soul to wander too close to break the rule again. And when they did, the cycle would start anew. I stepped through the door and into the night, the cold air washing over me as I left Blackthorn Manor behind. The gates creaked open, but as I walked away, I couldn't help but glance back, and I could have sworn I saw the figure standing in the window, watching me as I left.